Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask an awful lot of questions. You can also become a bitter pill or a spoonful of sugar and make your life better by going to patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. Today, we're going to be talking about all kinds of things with a good friend of the show, all-around activist, and a good bloke, a good person. Adrian Boutureira, he's been all over the world in activist causes from Central America, South America, knows a ton, and he's just a wealth of information every time we have him on. Adrian, are you there?
I'm here.
Awesome, man. How you been? What's going on?
Oh, well, just a lot of things, and ready to hit the road running here with you and touch base for the sake of our sanity. Talking to you, it's half informational to the public and half therapy for me, because sometimes I start to wonder whether I'm losing my mind with the thoughts that come to my head, and then talk to you and I feel better.
God help you, man. God help you. Like that Violent Femmes album. It's like the blind leading the naked. So good for you.
Oh man, yeah, exactly. So it's like, you make me feel like a moderate.
Oh, well, good. All right. That's yesterday's.
Yeah, man, it's fantastic.
Yesterday, one of my guests compared me to Doug Stanhope preaching in front of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, and I was like, "That's awesome. Good. It's good company.
That's fantastic.
All right, man. So let's jump into it. So, first of all, I don't know if it's big news. I don't watch a whole lot of mainstream media, to be very honest. But the GM strike to me is big news. I mean. And they pulled the health insurance from the striking workers, and meanwhile the CEO, who's supposedly not making any profit, they're paying her $22 million a year. So what's going on with all that?
Okay, well, I mean, clearly, there are several. Let's just first, go very quickly over the demands. Healthcare being one of them. Wages, they want to eliminate this ridiculous tier system, and I'll go a little bit into that. And of course, job security when, GM, keeps closing down plants and opening up, plants in China and in Mexico. And so the negotiations, depending on where you get the info. Folks are, of course, you got, the Washington Post and the New York Times and a lot of the mainstream media are really reporting this as unreasonable demands being made by the union, a way for union leadership to divert attention from the corruption scandal, where the houses of at least 4 or 5 different top executives of the union have been raided because of, misappropriation of union funds. The reality is that, during, in 2008 and 9 and 10, when GM went bankrupt, the union and the workers made huge concessions. Mm-hmm. They even, I guess, they wanted to save the job, and in order to save the job, they had to lift, GM out of bankruptcy. So they basically agreed to wage freezes. They agreed to like a 2-tier wage structure, which had been hugely progressive in terms of like what you made when you came into the plant as a union member, and then how quickly you reached the top, right? All of that was shaken up, and the workers were expecting that this was going to change. Now the company, is making record profits. We're talking about $35 billion, in the last few years, and they're geared to making several billion just in this quarter alone. Mm-hmm. So the workers, regardless of what the leadership is, and the leadership, if anything, remains a problem. The first day of the strike, there was one of the first things that happened was there was a strike, and the GM workers crossed the picket line of that strike, of the maintenance folks that were striking. And so this just gives you an idea of the disconnect in terms of preparing for this strike and having the rank and file, be very, very, actively involved in the process. I mean, Sure. They're kind of learning, from what I'm hearing, from reading labor notes, which it's the source I would recommend everybody to go to get information on U.S. labor. Labor notes. It's a fantastic publication, and they call it like they see it on behalf of the workers. And so, when in reading labor notes, I'm learning that you had picket lines where a lot of the folks were not even fully informed of what the strike was about as per what management was negotiating. They know what they want.
Right.
You have temporary workers now being hired who have been temporary workers, some of them for 3 years. There are some people who are considered to be temporary workers, and they've been there for almost 5 years.
Sure, absolutely.
The wage at that level is like $15. Some of the top workers are making $29, $30. That is creating a huge. So divide and conquer.
Absolutely.
And they want that stopped. The workers themselves, they want to sort of normalize the permanency of these temporary workers. They want to be able to continue to have the health coverage that they feel the company needs to provide, and at the rate in which it's being provided, which it's a huge gain. But it has been, it's one of the things that the company wants to erode. The elimination of the tier system so that, the wages are stabilized and the condition of the workers, who are temporary workers becomes normalized. All of this is the bulk of the negotiations. Of course, if you read in the media, the GM's proposal, which they are praising, which is, an investment of $7 billion in 4 states, in 8 facilities. Some of that money is not even, and let's remember that, GM was bailed out, and if it hadn't been for the workers, GM, would have collapsed, and all of these concessions, were never meant to be permanent.
Right.
Now they're, what they're guaranteeing does not address some of the main concerns of the workers. In other words, some of it's like, okay, so you're spending money in 8 facilities in 4 states, $7 billion supposedly, but I mean, that's for your own profitability.
Right.
In other words, okay, so they're trying to package that as like, promising job security, and I think to the beat of 5,000 jobs or 5,500 jobs is what they're trying to guarantee that this sort of investment would guarantee us bringing in, and some sort of lump sum of pay increases. But that's not what they want. They want this. They want to be able to normalize eliminate the tier system and go back to where it was before the crisis, before the company was bailed out. They want to make sure that their health care is guaranteed, and the workers are going to keep striking. I believe that as the strike continues, it's going to get a little bit more difficult. I think the company is losing like about $50 million a day during the strike.
One of the reports I read was $400 million a day.
Yeah, it's hard to assess, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, regardless, it's a lot of money. The workers are not getting paid.
Right.
Their health insurance is not getting paid. It's the first time, I believe, in a strike by GM, by United Auto Workers, where the company stops paying health care during the strike.
Well,
there'll
probably be a lawsuit for that after the strike is resolved. I can guarantee you.
Yes, I mean, something's going to have to happen. In the meantime, the unions are picking up that tab for the workers, and the $230 a week guaranteed, income for the workers while they're on strike doesn't kick in until the 15th day at the picket line. So right now, the workers are, writing it out.
Well, let me ask you quickly. So, because I know we got some other stuff we want to cover, but let me ask you something. So, when the bailout went down, and I felt the same way that I'm going to say right now about the banks. Why didn't we put because this is not new, what I'm going to say, but why didn't we put GM in receivership? Why didn't we fire the C-level guys? Make a worker co-op out of it, have the union sit on the boards, and then create a structure where the CEO doesn't make more than 10 times the average salary as opposed to 520 times.
You're such a socialist, Abe. This is America, man.
Well, Obama,
we don't do socialism here. We don't do socialism.
The social. I'm not. Well, I mean, if you fucked up, if you don't make your house payment, it goes into receivership. You're taking taxpayer money. We're the taxpayer. You should go into receivership.
Yes, of course. That is definitely. I hope all the. Your audience knows me well enough by now that I was just joking. This is we're not talking about my house. You know what I mean? We're not talking about the fact that if I miss my tax payments, 1 year, within a week, or 2 weeks, I have mail, that starts to put fear about me losing my ability to have a roof over my head. So that's not how corporate America functions, in relationship to our government. And, by now, sorry, go ahead.
Well, we had Obama. Obama was president, right? Wasn't he supposed to be this great liberal lion?
But Obama, I don't particularly, my expectations, from the moment that, he was elected, when I saw, how he was populating his cabinet posts, I knew immediately where this was going to go. So Obama never once, declare, open war, or even close war, or any kind of war, or even, ever managed to properly stand up to the corporate interest. So GM with the banks, we're talking about after what they did, after the crisis, we're talking about it would have been a golden opportunity to do exactly what you're talking about. Reconstitute, the management structures. Yeah. Get the workers involved. A lot of the stuff that's part of the, the Green New Deal that we're talking about with the Economic Bill of Rights and some of the plans that let's say the Green Party is proposing and trying to sort of, push the agenda as far as it can on this issue, so that the Green New Deal does not become yet another form of of corporate welfare. Yeah. Which I don't know if you heard the hearings on climate change where they had, the Swedish young lady and some of the Americans. There's a guy in there named Backer, who was the only guy, and he was a little bit older, I believe, than the other folks, the other young folks that were there. And he was just basically eating it up, he was giving them exactly like, this is he did not talk, for instance, about a just transition, right? Because, the movement for a just transition, is huge and he needs to be a big part of it. And, of course, he was just basically feeding the idea that capitalism, and the market, can help fix this, and I couldn't believe it. Then, luckily, there was a young woman, and I apologize for not really remembering her name right now, a Colombian American young lady who basically, when came her turn, she says, we have a problem here that was created by buying and selling and colonialism. Oh, wow. And this is not a problem that can be fixed by more buying, more selling, and more colonialism. In a nutshell, she came as close as any of them did to calling out, capitalism cannot fix this, right? Right. She might as well have said, capitalism, but, buying and selling and colonialism put together sort of, rang a bell in my head. And it was brilliant. It was brilliant because basically, the Congress, the congressman at the hearing kept saying, so, Mr. Backer, so basically that's it. That's the same line. The Democratic mainstream, the mainstream of the Democratic Party is not prepared, has not been prepared to take on, the corporate order and the corruption. And what we did is used a whole bunch of taxpayer dollars to bail them out. we left the same corrupt people in charge, they might have shaken up some trees because, they're opportunists and they cannibalize each other a little bit.
Right.
Right? But when they start cannibalizing each other, it's not like, the workers are at the table,
right.
for like a piece of the action.
Right.
When they start cannibalizing each other, they just kind of throw somebody out there, as a sacrificial lamb every once in a while. And then the next corrupt corporate, pig gets on the saddle and does the same thing. So they're earning billions. The company's earning billions. They're basically making very few concessions. The union needs to clean house. I hope they can stay focused. I hope that the corruption thing doesn't become a distraction, because that's not the fight that the rank and file need to be engaging in. I believe those folks. This will help the union. This will ultimately help the union, in spite of the poor leadership, because this will help the rank and file and the shops, become tighter. And I believe that the day, the days of the corrupt leadership at the auto workers union are counted. And that's another positive that's going to come out of this. I hope the union comes out much stronger from this experience, including cleaning house internally. As you know, pro-union sentiment across the country it's at an all-time high, at least for the last 20 years. I believe there are, I was reading something where like 60-something% of the country now supports the idea of unions.
Yeah, well, but then we waited until it dropped from a 30% participation in the '60s to a 6% participation now. So now, hopefully, it's something that can be salvaged, and we can have more federal, or what do you want to call it, national unions that override the right to work in the different states. Like here in Texas, we have SEIU. We've got UAW. We've got stuff like that here in Texas because it's a national union. So it does override. The Communication Workers of America, that does override the state's bullshit with right to work. But really quick, moving on, you mentioned the leadership of the union. I want to kind of shift gears here a little bit. Let's talk for a second about the Democratic, quote, existential threat to the so-called Republican regime. I mean, I don't see anybody who's going to beat Donald Trump that the Democrats are pushing. And while I'm not a big Sanders fan, he's the only one that could genuinely give Trump a run for his money, and they're already screwing him out of possibly the next debate. And the mainstream media I've seen, omit him completely. And he's as left as the Democrats are going to get, and yet they're trying to fuck him again. So, before we start getting into some other stuff here, like what are your thoughts on that? Well,
yeah, I mean, which leads to the problem that I'm having with a lot of my friends in the left. What are we doing? Because Sanders, it's not the first time that this has happened to him.
Nope.
He the belief in a lot of people in the left, I've been trying to really hold back, because I honestly believe that, another Trump presidency would be, I keep reminding folks because, I try to keep myself working from a historical perspective. And the lesser of two evils narrative, every single election cycle, we're told the same thing. This is not the time for independent leftist politics. We have to, pull rank and we have to, pull it together, and we have to, create, support whoever the Democratic establishment throws out there because of how evil, this particular guy is, So we've been hearing that forever. Now, I believe that the realities from the scientific community are not lying. I don't think that, that climate change is a fabrication of environmental, extreme leftists. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I believe that the science community has more than amply shown that this is real. And in the last 2 years alone, Abe, the figures and the assessments and the calculations have been retweaked to the point where we are moving much faster, towards the increase in temperature, towards the elimination of fish stocks, towards the melting of the Arctic. In the levels of storms, the climate. So now, can the planet afford this guy? I don't think it can. So I'm, and I've had this conversation with Howie, because clearly, we're in the business of supporting third-party politics. We know that the duopoly is doomed. We know that we're talking about a corrupt oligarchy that has time and time again, put the corporate interest, which I don't, people keep saying the 1%, and that started with, that whole 1% thing that got started, with the Occupy movement. I wish that it would be like really revised, in the rhetoric, because it creates a false impression. It makes it sound like the oligarchy is isolated, in that 1%, while we are 99%. It almost makes it sound like we're in the 1900s in a coal mining town in northern England,
yeah.
Where you have like the mine owners and then the rest of us all dying of black lung by the time we're 30. That's not the case. There is like a huge sort of buffer there. Where the wealth, the people need to start looking at wealth distribution, not income distribution, but wealth distribution, and then to start looking at it in quintiles.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So you have like the top 2%, the top 2 quintiles in this country control, 75% or 80% of the wealth.
Right.
And the class solidarity that emanates from that starts to create a much more clear sort of political strategic picture of what needs to happen, as we organize, in the other 3 remaining quintiles.
Right.
Right. But to think that somehow there is 1% and 99% and that we have a basis for beginning a political transformation, or with 99% of people on board, it's dangerously misleading if we want to look at this from a class struggle perspective.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about 25% of the population, that will continue to identify with the wealthiest 1%. Mm-hmm. That's the same class. It's the same class. So some are making $1 billion while other ones are making, 3 or 4 million. It's the same class, and
right.
They're going to keep doing what they're doing. And this is, what we have, what we're combating. I believe that Sanders, is being targeted by the Democratic establishment. And like I said before, it remains unclear to many people, and maybe you can shed some light on this. I'm sure you've been thinking about it yourself. What is Sanders thinking? I mean, is like an intentional deception,
yes.
or is he just kind of,
yes.
convinced that somehow he's going to turn it around?
I think he believes that again, that he's somehow going to turn it around. But like I saw an interview with Chris Hedges about a year and a half ago, and he said he was talking to Bernie Sanders, and he specifically said, "Why didn't you just take your delegates and go home? Why didn't you just go and throw in your hat with Jill Stein?" And she offered you to run. They're on all 50 states. The ballots are on all 50 states. And he said he didn't want to be marginalized and turned into Ralph Nader. His words. Because of what they did, what the so-called left did to Ralph Nader. Back in the 60s and 70s, and I remember being a kid, Ralph Nader was all over the news. Right? Every other month he was in front of Congress. Right? I saw an interview. Right. I saw an interview with Nader about 3 years ago, and they said, "Hey, are you worried about your legacy?" And he's like, "What are you going to do? Take away seatbelts?" It's like, basically the question was, but the answer was like, well, fuck you and fuck a legacy. I've got a legacy. But the challenge with Sanders, I see, as the last time, he comes out and says all the great shit. I think he meant it the first time. I think he believed it the first time. He had the big crowds the first time. I don't think he believed he was going to get fucked as unbelievably as he did. And then he did the sheepdog thing, which we've got a history of this. Eugene McCarthy famously did that when he took Bobby Kennedy's delegates because they threw themselves over to Eugene McCarthy, and then Eugene McCarthy went ahead and gave him to Hubert Humphrey. Well, the Bobby Kennedy delegates, right. They didn't want.
Right, but I mean, what you just said, Abe, is so important, and such few people, have that one down. I have a dear friend of mine who I've known for almost 30 something years and 32 years. And we get together for, a little bit of basketball, at least 2 or 3 times a week. And all we do while we're playing, which increases in physical violence as as the political rhetoric goes further and further. I got the bruises to show it.
Yeah.
And I believe that he represents, the sort of the bulk of the common running narrative, about how votes matter. That somehow, what we're talking about here is making sure that people get out and vote, and that. And I don't think they understand that how the nomination actually works.
Right.
And I started reviewing the some of the sort of reforms that were made to the delegate system, and for the life of me, I did not really find anything that hugely significant in those reforms.
No, the only thing they did was keep the superdelegates out of the first ballot. That's it. That's why this year they got they got 25 guys running because no one's going to get 51% of the vote, and the superdelegates get to vote in the second ballot. That's the big change. It's bullshit. I mean, Tom Perez is as corrupt as a mafia don. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, those guys are just assholes. And honestly, and this is what they're going to do. They're going to fuck Sanders. Excuse me. He doesn't want to spend the rest of his life, however much he has long on this planet, marginalized and kicked off of every committee, and worse, primaried in his state. That he's been very popular in for years and years, and the so-called left doesn't pay attention to his voting record on wars, his voting record on defense, his voting record on approving Trump's budgets for defense. And he talks about regime change wars but he's been cool with everything we've done. He did not vote for military action against Iraq in 2001, but he sure as hell voted for us to go in 2003. So.
And he also supported, the carpet bombing of Serbia,
yes.
During the conflict.
Yes.
But look, I mean, the bottom line is that I think Sanders sees himself as a kind of, Roosevelt type of figure. He remains sort of wedded to an understanding of the relationship of the United States to the rest of the world, which kind of reinforces an imperialist narrative, from a social democrat perspective, which is in some ways no different from what the so-called even, by name, the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, which is in power, has been kind of doing through NATO and through support of the United States,
right.
Interventionist wars, under their leadership all over the world, because socialism, and internationalism have been, at least from at the mainstream, socialist democratic movement is concerned, has not been an internationalist movement now for many, many decades.
Right.
And so now, I mean, but what I'm trying to say to folks, let's not say we still cannot confuse, those realities of a Bernie Sanders presidency, which are not revolutionary. It would not be a revolutionary presidency, but it would probably be the most leftist presidency, and then we can, go as far as we want to go with what that means when we just affirm that, imperialism is in the agenda of this leftist.
100%.
But, I mean, there is no, it would still be a significant shift, and it would change the narrative in this country. And, and I believe, from our perspective, it would put our issues front and center. And if Sanders drops the ball, and he either gets forced to not be able to implement anything from the Green New Deal, Sanders has actually adopted an economic bill of rights, that was a big part of the difference between our Green New Deal and Ocasio's, for instance. Sanders, now is talking about an economic bill of rights as part of his Green New Deal. I mean, we're talking about some pretty sort of, incredible, traditionally speaking, un-American things that would land front and center. And if Bernie ends up betraying those, which is what we all think, betraying intentionally or completely, handcuffed, and incapacitated by the Democratic establishment from getting anything done, then I think it would create a great platform for the left to spend 4 years saying this is what we told you was going to happen. We saw it happening. For some miracle, Bernie did get elected, but now he can't even begin to get some of his most basic proposals passed, and we're still where we were, and we're still struggling, and the unions are still struggling, and we're still paying corporate welfare.
But then at that point, it's our job to remind these assholes that their alternatives were Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren. And you're putting some cart before the horse. Before we move on, I just want to make this point and then start moving on to some other items that we talked about discussing. But you're putting some cart before the horse, because what's going to happen is Sanders isn't going to get the nomination. And then he's going to come out and he's going to finger wag at us we got to beat Trump. We got to beat Donald Trump. He's an existential threat to humanity. And, he's going to do that whole thing. And then the Dem little slaves are going to be wagging their finger at us and clutching their pearls and saying, "You're going to give us 4 years." No. You gave us 4 years of Trump. You fucking pricks. You gave us 4 years of Trump.
Yes, of course. But I mean, people have to start getting prepared for that. I told Phil, I said, look, man, don't worry about, anybody. No, I said, you have your work cut out for you. If you believe in this process, and you believe, you better be ready to pull a Chicago 1968.
That's what's going to happen. That's what's going to have to happen. That's what's going to have to happen.
If that doesn't happen, then nobody has, of course, it depends on how the vote goes down. But people are saying that that either Warren or Sanders are eventually going to throw in the towel and endorse the other, and that's going to ultimately produce the numbers that will make it practically impossible for Biden to get the nomination without creating exactly what we're talking about. I don't know if that's I just don't see that happening. I don't see Warren and Sanders, closing ranks in order to sort of fight the Democratic establishment. Maybe Sanders may be a little bit, but which one is going to surrender their quest for power? And we know that Warren is already, at least in numbers of delegates, she's only 50 delegates off. Oh, that was the other thing I meant to tell you. When you started, the way you were framing it, it's already happening, right? So It's like, I was reading a CNN report, an opinion report, which was kind of one of their top stories when I opened the page on the 2020 election, which basically said, it is now a two horse race. They're already putting that out there. Then I started to do some research, and I looked at the most recent polls independently, and I found this site that has all the polls, assessed and represented in the numbers. And I realized that out of the last 6 polls, they had Warren, beating Sanders, and the other 3 had Sanders beating Warren, and some of them were disparate. The ABC Wall Street Journal poll had Warren beating Sanders by 14 percentage points, and the Reuters poll had Sanders beating her by 5 percentage points, and everything in between. So they come up with these averages, which basically the polls are clearly, how in the world can you be running accurate, polls that have those disparate results? So clearly, the polls are being manipulated, and what I'm seeing, there's a tendency there to manipulate the polls. There was one thing, there was one news item about 3 weeks ago that some college did this poll, which basically showed Sanders ahead of Warren, and they were chewed out by everybody. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was not scientific. It was not representational, blah, 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 blah. So without a doubt, even with, Sanders' compliance, into the whole, Democratic Party's establishment's manipulations with, capitulating as he did, supposedly because he gave him his word, that's great. They are clearly still frightened. They're still clearly, intent on taking him down.
Right.
And I believe, again, I would like to affirm, and I'm sorry if I'm pissing off my my leftist comrades, but I don't think that a Sanders presidency can compare to a Trump presidency or even to a Biden presidency, because I think it would have a significant impact on the narrative.
Of course. Well, of course.
I think, come what may, we will have gained a platform to organize our troops based even on the failures of Sanders.
But see, here's the thing,
especially on the failures of Sanders.
But see, here's the thing, though, and we got to move on. But real quick, if Biden got the nomination, first of all, all he is Trump with nicer tweets. That's it. I got in this huge debate with a friend of mine last night, and he was like, "Oh no, Trump's an existential threat." I go, Biden, you're saying any blue will do? Biden is Trump. Crime bill, Iraq, gutting welfare. I mean, he voted for all that shit. He's a horrible person.
Right.
He just sends out nicer tweets and keeps talking about Scranton. And before we move on, I just want to make this last point. If this goes down the way we're talking, the Democrats won't survive another DNC 1968. They will become the Whig Party. If they fuck over Bernie Sanders, and they will, and they ram down some person that, like half their party base is against, and they lose the election, which they will, then it's over. They're going to have to move on and there's going to be more parties coming in. I can hardly wait to watch the destruction of these corrupt assholes. But speaking of corrupt assholes, let's talk about Iran.
No. I mean, let me just say, I hope, Abe, that I don't think that they're going to go down, that easily. I don't think we're going to see the Democratic Party, regardless of their folly and their failure, just to reinforce their corrupt establishment. I think that the level of mass control, the level of don't forget, they have simultaneously raised the stakes at any form of social disobedience, of resistance, right? So while all of this is happening, resistance, even nonviolent resistance is being criminalized, right? So if you dare to protest against a pipeline, in your state,
right,
you better be prepared to face felony charges, and there are people who already are. So so the criminalization of civil disobedience, it's changing, how people are capable of resisting. It's also, I think, creating a much more passive population. So we have fascism manifesting itself beyond mere economics in our country, right? We have, beyond Trump's sort of dismantling of environmental, laws and just basically, throwing the whole economy open for the rape and pillage of the corporation, at a whole new light, because he's not even pretending, he doesn't even pretend, so there's not even the sort of appeasing bill, okay, well, 100 bills favor corporations, then we'll sign this bill so that there is no more plastic bags,
right.
allowed to be thrown into the ocean.
Yeah.
It's all right, man, we won. So that's the mentality where we're at. So besides that realm of economics, there is the sort of rise of fascism and how it's impacting people's minds and how they view their relationship to the state and how they view the omnipotency of the state. Right. So so basically, in order for there to be people in the streets like there are in France, you need, basically ready to throw down and confront the state head on, like people did in this country in 1968. There needs to be a whole shift from the paradigm of, if they're calling Bernie Sanders a sheepdog, then, it's very accurate. You know what I mean? Because it is sheep.
And we got to move on here, but that is exactly my point. He's not going to get the nomination. He's going to do that. And that's where I think the Democratic Party will disappear, because people will not be supporting it. There'll be a party wholly solely supported by corporations. If they pull what they pull again, what they did in 2016, they're going to be wholly owned by corporations. There's not going to be any human beings donating that fucking party, and they're gonna have a hard time pushing this "any blue will do" bullshit when their sins come to the fore. Speaking of sins, I wanted to talk about Cheeto Jesus and his bullshit trying to get into Iran on some pretense that, because we don't know still. I mean, the missiles that landed in Aramco came from the east. They came from the west and the northwest. They did not come from the east. Iran is in the east, if anybody looks at a map. And I'm going to say it. I have not seen this in any media. I've not seen this in any alternative media. I would not be surprised if Israel, even though the Houthis took the Houthi rebels took credit for what happened, the cruise missiles, they still can't explain the cruise missiles. And so I would not be surprised if Israel actually launched the cruise missiles trying to frame Iran for it. And that's just a paranoid. That's a paranoid theory based on everything Israel does. They bomb the shit out of everybody, including Iraq and Syria and Libya and Lebanon. But I'm just anyway. That's my opinion.
Well, without a doubt, Israeli-U.S. hegemony in the region has been a driving factor in everything from the Arab Springs that were never anything other than sort of puffs of smoke, right. As we, now we're experiencing, some kind of attempt in Egypt. People are out in the streets. There's very few that's being reported on that in the U.S. media, but, our second favorite or third, our puppet, El Sisi, was basically what the Egyptian oligarchy and the, and the United States and the Egyptian military decided to put in power, and throwing thousands of people in jail without a trial, disappearances, and so now there is noise again in Egypt. But I start to look and I start to see some of the same players, some other dubious characters arise, and I'm thinking to myself, well, this is off to a weird start. The main instigator of that. It's a guy, who is a military contractor, a developer, and I'm thinking, okay, so this guy is crying foul over corruption. But I mean, if you start to look at his background, then we're not in any better shape in some ways in terms of like, the Egyptian working class, self-organizing themselves, because a lot of the leadership has been exterminated. So we have Israeli hegemony being maintained, by all possible ways. What business did, what is it that the United States is accusing Iran of doing? In other words, responding to the request of assistance from Syria when, after they, the country, was being destroyed and has been destroyed in some ways, sent back to the dark ages from a proxy war of the Gulf states and the Wahhabist movement and Western imperialism to try to yet again, take out and get and isolate Iran as much as they could. So Iran, what else? So now, the thing is that there is still no hard evidence for anything, Abe. And I've been looking, you mentioned the direction of the missiles. First of all, there were supposed to be drones. Where they came from, any hard evidence needs to be proven, because if they knew where they came from, then that means it would have been in the radar, and they would have been able to see them, and then they
could show that to us, and they could show that to us. It's not like they don't have radar. It's not like they don't have pictures of this shit. It's not a mystery.
Right, but they still haven't provided the evidence that the missiles came from Iran, or that the drones flew all the way from Iran, and the idea being that the Yemeni, which are not, we have to be careful with referring to them as Houthi rebels, because it almost makes them sound like they are the ones, that, they represent the Yemeni government and the legitimate government of the country, and Saudi Arabia and the United States have been engaged in a 4-year, 5 years, going on 5 years war that has been genocidal.
Right.
Where we know 80% of the children in Yemen are at the, being classified as suffering from malnutrition, where they're targeting civilian targets. It is one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world right now.
It is, and this is a question.
I guess
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you guess what?
No, I guess the expectation is, and this is where, I do not understand the running narrative in the mainstream media. I do not understand the running narrative with most Americans, that don't see it. In other words, it's like you don't have to be a political scientist to know that Saudi Arabia is one of our client states.
Right.
That we are basically, protecting Saudi Arabia, and that we are arming Saudi Arabia, and everyone knows that Saudi Arabia is murdering thousands and thousands of people in Yemen and destroying that society.
Well,
exactly by what rationale, other than this incredible arrogance of empire? And I invite people to think about it, because behind it is it's almost this insidious exceptionalism that somehow we are allowed to destroy countries like we did Libya, bomb them, go to Serbia, bomb, leave nuclear residue like we did in Iraq, where children are now showing radioactive contamination in their bones, from our depleted uranium that we left all over the battlefields and communities all over Iraq, and yet somehow even acts of self-defense are criminalized.
Well, let me ask you a question. Okay, but let me ask you a question though. So why did the Obama administration get a bug up their ass so far that they had to go in there and try to oust the government, because the Houthis did take over, and the internationally recognized government of Yemen was the enemy. Does that sound familiar? And then Obama started steaming in and continue with Trump by supporting the Saudis. Why do the Saudis have such a bug up their ass to get rid of this government?
Again, I think it has to do with geopolitical alignments, right? The Houthi. I mean, we have. It is critical. It is critical for the United States to maintain, hegemony over the Gulf states. It is, and the Arabian Peninsula. It is critical. The objective has always been Iran. Mm-hmm. Now, Iran is surrounded by U.S. military interests. We're talking about 45 bases throughout the region, with at least half of those concentrated in the border states around Iran. I mean, just so and then you put together. So the aggressor, who is isolating whom? Now, Iran clearly sees an opportunity and has a partner in Yemen, and they're supporting and they're responding in support of Yemen, and the aggressor. Now, I mean, to me, it's as simple as making sure that Israel remains an influence and maintaining Israel's hegemony in the Middle East, while also maintaining Saudi hegemony and complete control over the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf. Mm-hmm. And as long as those are two major client states in the area, and we basically, that's the motivation. The motivation is to neutralize any possible break in that sort of power scheme. It's so the United States. I mean, it's what we've done. It's what we do. It's not like a wild hair got inside Obama's ass. It's just like, okay, well, any time there is a potential threat to the geopolitical hegemony that we have mapped out, we intervene. And we intervene in different fashions. We intervene by supporting and arming and encouraging our client states to do our bidding, or we just intervene directly, or we intervene economically. And right now, we're talking about war against Iran for some unfounded attack that's like, that for which they have no evidence, but which, within 2 days, even before the Saudis themselves, accused anybody, or, Pompeo was already saying Iran did it. There was no evidence. When he started saying that, and this is what people need to understand, it's like, look at the data, and then look at, if you don't believe that, what Abe and I are saying to you about, how the intentionality precedes the fact, then again, there is also a lot of chest pounding. And I know that, you think that war is imminent. I'm just not quite sure of that. For one thing, Iran is not Libya.
Right.
Iran,
they're not Iraq either.
Yes, I believe that there is a lot more going on. Iran is not necessarily as isolated, as one may think. And so I think that, given what would be at stake, they may just want to leave this one alone. How is the situation going to be ultimately resolved? Maybe through some insane act of military aggression, by the United States and its allies. I think, that would be the beginning of the end, for the prospects of any kind of non-military solution, of course, but also, it would be disastrous. It would be disastrous at a global level. Mm-hmm. With the state of affairs as it is right now, with Russian troops on the ground. I really don't even want to contemplate that scenario.
Right.
At the same time that I don't want to contemplate that scenario, I am really, really struggling here to try to figure out, how can this be resolved without that very, very destructive, scenario. So, I am still not as convinced that this will result in an actual armed conflict this time around, because I don't think they have the evidence, because I don't think Iran did it.
They did well, and if they did, they could show us the radar. If they did, they have. This isn't like, oh, we think they did it. You either have it or you don't have it. The world is, everything's on camera now, and the Defense Department, they have that. They have the radar. They have everything. NORAD looks at everything. We can't get a picture of an overhead picture of a trajectory of missiles from Iran to Saudi Arabia. That's just stupid.
No, of course. Especially given the pictures that Trump was showing, about a month ago, that he basically, took a photo of, and they had this insanely high resolution pictures of an Iranian missile testing site, that had a mislaunching of a missile.
Right.
And, that picture was taken, by a drone. That there's no way that the clarity and the proximity of the pictures, all the military analysts said that was that it caught the whole military intelligence community by surprise, the level of detail. So the United States knows very well, what's going on at all times, I believe. So, they actually let this happen, Abe, you know what I mean? And we can start, like you were saying, we can go back to, to sort of, speculation number one. And, is this something that was engineered? But the, Yemen, the Houthi rebels, assumed responsibility immediately.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did.
And I don't think they would have done that, for no reason. And I believe that if we think about it, was a very strategic blow. The Saudis are going to have to rethink a few things now.
Oh, sure.
So either,
sure.
Either they managed to talk, the United States into an all-out war against their historical, sort of geopolitical enemies in the region, and the United States ends up doing something, insane, which, would completely dismantle, U.S. hegemony. To me, there is no way that the Europeans are going to go for it. They got their hands full in Europe right now.
They sure do.
There is no way. I don't think the mood is for another intervention against Iran, because the Europeans have not necessarily. I mean, they're not directly challenging U.S. Leadership in the Middle East, but they're still continuing to engage the Iranians. They're trying to do what they can. They're begrudgingly. Europe doesn't have the muscle to go head on against the United States, nor does it have the political motivation, because ultimately the interests remain the same. On the other hand, they are not happy with this guy. You know what I mean?
No, yeah,
and
absolutely.
they got their hands full, and they're dealing with Brexit, and they're dealing with the Brits, and the Brits themselves are dealing with the prospect of a new referendum in Scotland, and Spain has not been able to form a government, and it's going to be like the fourth election in 4 years. The Italians are Europe.
It's a mess.
It's going to be a really, really hard sell for any European country to actually come forth and support, some insane military intervention against Iran right now. So the Saudis are going to have to bite the bullet. And look, the Houthis are saying right now, we won't bomb you again.
Right. They offered a ceasefire, a few days back. So, yeah, they're trying to say, listen, but we're getting tired of being bombed and murdering our people. But listen, in the few minutes we got left, let's hit on the Israeli election for a hot minute, because we got about maybe 5-6 minutes left, and I wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. Bibi got indicted for corruption and fraud, whatever. I mean,
no, he didn't. Wait, no, let's. He has his pre-indictment hearing October 2nd.
Oh, I thought he was indicted.
No, he has not been indicted yet. We're not even there yet. So
okay.
No, man. That this is why we're on a race against time. October 2nd. A lot of it is going to be dependent on whether he's able to form a government or not. He got even less seats than he did in the last election.
Right.
Gantz, won the election, but the president of the Israeli parliament, has the basically, the ability to the authority to determine, who he thinks is most likely to be able to form a coalition government.
Right.
So even though the Arab Alliance for the first time will be supporting a Zionist, the blue and white candidate Gantz, which is a retired military guy who basically, is not by any means leftist or even a centrist.
He's got blood on his hands too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so, but the Arab Alliance understanding very well, again, here we are dealing with an election where, the Arab Alliance may throw in their 13, votes, to try to help Gantz, form a government. But ultimately right now, it's Lieberman, who is the leader of an extreme right wing but secular party,
right.
Kahol Lavan. That's the name of the party. And one of the reasons why Netanyahu could not form a government the last time was because Kahol Lavan, refused to join his government composed of religious far-right parties, right? In other words, and because for whatever reason, Lieberman remains entrenched in this idea of a secular, Jewish state.
Right.
Oh man, it's kind of funny, but it's kind of sad. So
well,
funny.
It is funny because it's like complaining about the mafia that they have ethnocentric hiring practices. It's like it doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
unionized. So we have a situation where, this morning, I read some disturbing reports where Lieberman, may be willing to engage in dialogue towards the formation of a coalition or right wing unity party, if the religious parties agree to 2 or 3 of his demands, which we'll see what happens. Now, if that were to happen, if Netanyahu, because this guy has more lives than a cat, man. I mean, it's insane. It's insane, that he even managed to get the amount of votes that he has, given, the state of insecurity that he's created, given, the amount of the percentage of Arab Israeli voters that came out this time. I mean, I was, the corruption scandal, which everything is pointing towards an indictment. I mean, even though it hasn't happened, I believe the indictment, for all intents and purposes, is inevitable. I think, for what I can gather, there's plenty of evidence and that will lead to the indictment. But he can stay in power while he's indicted.
Oh, sure.
If yes, and the Likud party, there is no noise of a rebellion against him. I mean, Gantz, offered Likud a coalition government on the condition that it does not include Netanyahu. And basically, that's been rejected, right? So there is not going to be a center-right, right-wing coalition between the two major parties that would basically, leave out the Arab Unity parties, and he would leave out, the other minor parties, because they would have, I think, the votes amongst themselves to run the country. But, I mean, Gantz doesn't want, he wants Netanyahu out. He wants to be the leader of that coalition. And the Likud remains intent on leaving Netanyahu in there. And even as it's become clear across, Israeli society, that the guy is up to his neck in crimes.
Yep.
So, how is that going to get resolved? I mean, I am following it as closely as possible. It changes from day to day. I think it's a very volatile situation, especially in light of, the threat by Netanyahu of annexing 1/3 of the West Bank. I mean,
right.
I don't know, if, how much you've been following that, but one of his presidential promises, and it's the real frightening thing for me, I having expected, Likud to trail by much more, given the fact that in the time between the last two elections, a lot more evidence surfaced, reflecting Netanyahu's criminality. But, and then, he pulls this thing, says, okay, I may be a criminal and I may be really corrupt, but, if you still vote for me, I will go ahead. So he raised the stakes on the madness
right.
of expansionist, settler colonialism, Zionism, right? I mean, he basically now wants to annex 1/3. And of course, the third that he would annex is the third that
it's in the Jordan Valley.
Access to water.
What? Yeah, it's in the Jordan Valley. Well, listen, on that note, man, we gotta wrap it up. We are at the end of our time, but folks, I hope you've been enjoying this last hour. My guest has been Adrian Boutureira, and again, if you've heard him on the show before, you know that he's just knows his stuff, and he came on and graciously shared his time with us. As always, thank you, sir. And we are on patreon.com/The Bitter Truth. If you want to become a member, you can also listen to the shows on Podcast Addict and YouTube and Spotify and all the usual suspects wherever these things are heard. And again, as always, folks, if this stuff makes you uncomfortable, it's supposed to. Sleep tight.